I think the most important piece of advice is still the same one, and that's around positioning. Like, what is it that you understand uniquely that other folks don't? I think if you understand that, you can parlay that into so many little micro successes.
Hello and welcome to the Jumpstart podcast with Jeffalytics. I'm your host, Jeff Sauer. Today, for our 37th episode, we're going to talk with David Baker, the founder of Recourses, and a sage of wisdom to agency owners who are looking to take on and address their biggest challenges. David and I were introduced to each other through another podcast guest named Dan Golden, who you recognize probably from episode 32. After Dan and I got done with our recording, we spent quite a bit of time talking about our agencies and our experiences, and he said, "You really need to talk to David and even have him as a guest on your podcast." So we had an initial conversation, and we discovered that we get along famously. We recorded this episode while I was in Thailand, and it's going to go live when I'm in India for the Super Week conference. This will be my third continent where I've done a Super Week conference, fourth continent speaking overall, and actually it's my fifth continent where I've recorded the Jumpstart podcast, and it's only been just a little bit over a year since we started this podcast. And I'm really looking forward to this conference because I can meet up with other industry friends and especially talk to the organizer, Zoli, who I've developed a nice relationship with over the past few years. Now back to David. When we first talked, it was one of those conversations where things felt effortless. I knew David and I were on the same page, and we practically finished each other's sentences. We shared our stories about agency ownership, the mistakes we made, and how we could help the next group of entrepreneurs move forward with their businesses. David's focus is working directly with agency principals to help them grow their business and overcome their biggest challenges. I loved hearing about his progression and how he has grown over time. There's a lot of wisdom in his words, so make sure you hang on to them if you're ever thinking about freelancing or owning your own agency someday. I also appreciated hearing that the services that he offers at Recourses are complementary to what I'm accomplishing with the Agency Jumpstart course, which is coming up in March of this year. You can actually take my course when you're just getting started out, and then you can work with Recourses when your agency needs some one-on-one attention. And that's where I'm going to leave it. Listen on for sage advice from David Baker as he talks about his career evolution, which has actually led to an agency revolution. Visit Jeffalytics.com/recourses for show notes. Okay, we're here today with David Baker. David, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. Very glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. You and I had a phone conversation, a month or two ago, and I think we learned a lot from each other, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about your career journey on the podcast.
Thank you. This should be interesting.
Yeah, so let's get right to it. So the question that I always start with is, what was the moment, the project, the client, whatever it was that made you excited to take on a career in marketing?
Well, it was very accidental. I don't know if the other folks you interview answer that question the same way, but for me, it was definitely accidental. I was about halfway through a 4-year full-time graduate program, and about 2.5 years into that, I was just reading the paper on the couch one day, and for some reason just happened to notice the ads that were in the paper, and they just struck me as so lame. And I thought, man, this is just like, how hard can this be? Why are these ads, why are these marketing statements so terrible? And it happened to hit me at a time when I was very dissatisfied with the academic career I was pursuing. And I decided that, you know what, maybe I need to step out of that and do something else. I wasn't sure enough about it to dump the academic career, but I did on the side begin to do some things in marketing and they were actually pretty embarrassingly lame, almost as lame as the ones that I was criticizing, the reasons that I got into it. But I decided to go ahead and try and do that. And it just felt very natural. I felt like there were so many things about my approach to life and work that seemed to fit the marketing world. And that led me down a long path. So that's really how I got into it.
So you basically see how bad the marketing in the world is, which I think we can both agree that there's still quite a bit of bad marketing out there.
Yeah.
And you're like, I can do this. And I would agree that our first attempts at trying to beat the bad marketing might not be any better. But I think that just noticing that there's a market need can be what we need to spark that passion in going forward.
Right.
So
yeah.
Did you find a job doing this? How did that progression work?
No, I just did it on my own from home part-time at first because I didn't really know if I had what it took. And probably the biggest disadvantage I had in those early months was that I had never worked at an agency. Most people that have started an agency have already worked for another one just as an employee, and I didn't have that experience. That was the biggest disadvantage I had, maybe the biggest advantage as well, because I kind of had to reinvent things. But as I just started to do that, it started to feel comfortable. I started to get clients and then hired our first employee and so on, and that started this long path of 6 years. We actually ended up with 16 employees, still a fairly small firm, but 16 full-time employees, and just slowly ramped up to that over 6 times. One of the things that helped me early on was hiring people who did have agency experience so that I could learn from them, of course.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's sort of how my agency started as well. We were just freelancing and decided we'd be stronger to have more than a few people, or more than just one, and started what you call an agency, but we had no experience in that area. I would say that definitely having no experience can be both a blessing and a curse, because you don't have to unlearn some of the aspects of an agency that maybe aren't the most efficient, or the politics behind it, but you also don't know if you're doing the right structure at the same time. Right. So it sounds like you had to figure that out and do a lot of it on your own.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was fun and terrifying at the same time. I remember one of the first pieces of, I guess, external insight I had, besides the employees I hired who had experience, was going to this round table that another consulting firm at the time, Second Wind Network, was offering. And I show up, and this is the first time I've met other agency owners, except for the few people that I just hated in town only because they were competitors. I'd never even met them. And I'm arriving at this event thinking that I'm going to learn a lot about, really going to fill in a lot of the gaps I had in terms of knowledge. And I didn't learn a lot from the event itself, but it was such a relief just to be there, because I just noticed primarily that the other agency owners were struggling with the same issues that I was. And oddly enough, I was not struggling with doing marketing for clients. I figured that out pretty quickly. What I was struggling with were really the issues around business. Like, how was I supposed to run a business well? And of course, that led to the second step on the career. But those were the early lonely days of just like, how much should I pay myself? And how do I manage other people? And how do I position the firm? And what are the ratios that I should be? Like, I didn't have answers to any of those questions. And so I had to rely on an outsider who had gathered that information from other agency owners. And that was a real light bulb that went off for me.
Yeah, it's interesting. Did you know to ask those questions, or did it take those roundtables to get you there? Because I think that a lot of people will start their own business, but they won't even know a lot of those questions. They just know that if money's coming in, then they think they're doing well.
Yeah, exactly. I think I was very naive in that same sense. And I remember vividly some of the entrepreneurial panic those days, the euphoria and the panic. So like, I'm sitting there working away, and all of us on the team are working away. And it dawns on me that we need to get invoicing out, because we eventually then need to get clients to pay so that we'll have money for payroll and so on. So I go in on a Saturday and issue all these invoices. And then I'm all excited because all these clients owe us money. And then on Monday, I'm not excited because they haven't paid us yet, right? So there's just always this panic one way or another. And that's really what motivated my understanding of business, in that it was very, very basic. I didn't even, like you said, I didn't even know what questions to ask. But eventually you start to figure out what questions to ask. And that's what struck me too, because there were other firms, even locally, this was before Google, obviously, so that our marketplace was very local. And
Hmm.
the firms around me had stronger traditions, and they were more creative than we were, for sure. And they certainly knew more from an analysis standpoint. But I just noticed that there wasn't much connection between great creativity and great business results. There was a connection, though, between great business results and making good business decisions, and not
Hmm.
necessarily being the most creative person, but making better business decisions. And so that was
Yeah.
sort of what took me down that path.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you're in it with your agency, you're growing, you're figuring these things out as you go along and asking questions, getting smart where you maybe didn't have the knowledge before. What happens then? Do you sell the agency? Does it go on? How do you transition out of that to becoming more of a consultant to teach agencies?
Yeah, so the other firm that I began to learn from was called Creative Business. They're out of Boston. They're still around. And you would subscribe to their monthly publication, and that subscription included the ability to call the editor up and ask any questions you wanted for free. I think that was his way of staying in touch with the marketplace, sort of in exchange for me speaking from the editor's standpoint, as I get to learn what's going on out in the agency world. So I would
Yeah.
talk to him and so on. And at some point, he asked me, he said, "Hey, one of the things I don't understand as well is the business side of this. I wonder, would you be willing to write an article or two for me on that, under your name, not as a ghost written article?" And I said, "Sure, I'll try that." And then, so that was the first step, just as a guest
Hmm.
article on running the business side of things, putting just in writing the things that I had already learned. The second step was that he was doing seminars, and he didn't have the bandwidth to do all the seminars he'd signed up for. So he would do the exciting cities and I would do the more boring cities for him. But I was really just reading the script. I was a voice. And but during those times, there'd be 10 or 15 or 20 people at the seminar, and they would ask questions, and I had to come up with answers. At first, a lot of those answers were borrowed beliefs, but eventually I started to figure things out, learning from the attendees, actually, and partly my own experience, but mainly from them. The pivotal moment came when I called him up one day and I said, "Hey, Cam, why don't you offer advice on a paid basis, like as a consultant to your subscribers?" And he
Hmm.
wasn't interested for various reasons, but he said, before I could even think about it, he said, "Would you be interested in doing that?" Of course, I was running a medium-sized agency at the point, and so that
Hmm.
had never occurred to me. And I said, "Well, maybe, I don't know." He said, "Well, I'll put an ad in the publication, and there's no risk because I'm not going to charge you for it, and you just give me 10% of everything you make." And I thought, well, what could I lose? So I did that, or he did that for me, actually. And the first agency called. It was out of Chicago, Westgate, I think the name of it was. And then that work picked up very, very quickly over, I think it was 6 or 9 months, something like that, to the point where
Hmm.
it was taking most of my time. I was really enjoying it. I basically just talked to everybody on staff. Two of the employees decided to start their own businesses, took a lot of the business with my blessing, and that launched almost 23 years ago my consulting and speaking and writing career, answering those business questions basically to help principals solve the issues that I had struggled so much to solve for myself.
Wow.
How it started.
That's cool. That's sort of an interesting genesis of how it goes, and it just proves that networking and talking to people and getting and putting yourself out there can really lead to a lot. And it's also good that your agency, even after you sort of stopped focusing on it, was able to thrive in some ways after doing that. After you left the business, and then you can focus on what you're really passionate about, which is solving those problems that you didn't know you had when you first started
Yeah,
your
right.
agency.
Yeah, and it didn't exist as the same agency at all, and there was no money changed hands. It just, we had some really good people who were very qualified, and it was so easy for them to step up and just transition to doing their own thing. And then some people, of course, changed careers. So, maybe looking back, I possibly could have packaged it into something. Probably not, because it wasn't a remarkable firm in any way. Just honestly, I'm not an advisor to this industry because I was running such an amazing firm. It just simply wasn't the truth. It was a struggling firm, a very normal kind of a firm that had ups and downs, and at that point it wasn't really doing that well anyway. So
Hmm.
in fact, that was one of the most difficult things for me at the beginning is that I felt like I wasn't an unusually great firm, and so what business did I have advising
Hmm.
other folks? And it dawned on me very quickly, though, that the value I would bring to the table was somewhat an analytical mind, but it was more that I was learning from seeing the inside of so many other firms and then putting all that together. It wasn't so much that I was such an amazing performer, it was that I had the opportunity to learn from other agency owners and pass that information along. Eventually it turned into me becoming an expert, but in those early days, I definitely was not an expert.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you can tell that obviously anytime that you're doing one thing and then you sort of move focus over to something else, that the business usually doesn't thrive, right? That's always what happens. Is if you're doing one thing and then something else comes along and you're focusing on that, then yeah, that's what ends up happening.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that's probably advice that you give to your customers as well, right? Is that you need to focus on your business, because if you try and go and do something else, it's probably not going to work out very well.
Yeah, exactly right. I always ask them to think sort of real ahead in time and then look back on the present and say, all right, 10, 15, 20 years from now, if you're not at that point as successful as you think you should have been, will it be because of lack of opportunity? You just didn't have enough opportunity, or will it be because you didn't focus? And the answer is
Hmm.
always because you didn't focus. I mean, the only people who don't have enough opportunity are really unlucky, which is rare, or they're just flat incompetent. That's just not what we struggle with. We don't struggle with lack of opportunity. We struggle with not focusing on the few opportunities that we should focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree that any company that can get heads down and can do the work and can do good work, they're not going to have trouble getting introductions and finding opportunities.
Right.
An interesting thing that you said that I think is a good transition into how this works as being somebody who coaches and consults with agencies is that you get introductions to a lot of different agencies. Now, I remember in the early days of my agency, we would sit there in a room and we thought we were doing great work, but we'd always say, I wonder if we're just an echo chamber of ourselves and
Hmm.
we just think that we're great, or if others do, if our clients just like us because they like working with us, where we are in the market. Like you said, focus is so important to growing a healthy agency. Focus a lot of times is on delivering results for your clients, and it's on just doing the work. So you don't always have an outlet to ask those questions or a sounding board. And so it sounds like you, by having the opportunity to talk to a lot of different agencies and people, you get to pull like the struggles from everybody and understand them and start to solve them.
Right. And I do sense that most agency owners feel that same thing you just described, that they really are special. And I think they really are special to their clients because it's just obvious that their style, their type of work, their process, and so on is going to attract a certain kind of client who's going to keep telling them that they're great. And so the agency owner continues to believe that rather than putting it in a broader context. It's just that, no, this is the way you work as an agency, and you're going to attract clients that like that, but you're not all that unique in terms of your process or your approach or your personality. It really should be defined by your expertise rather than those other things. Now, those other things are important, but they don't make you special. They just make you a better fit for certain clients. Your expertise is really what your agency should be built around. And that expertise ought to be very narrow. It doesn't have to be vertical, but it needs to be very narrow and articulated. And it needs to help you draw the right employees and the right clients and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. So niching down or choosing a specific niche that you want to serve, whether it's clients or the service you provide,
Right.
just being very clear with where you're going to focus on.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Because like I referenced the fact that this is pre-Google, and what I meant by that was really pre-search engine, which happened to be Google, in the sense that back then, almost all of your clients were local. If you were really good, they were regional. Nowadays, a client, when they need something, they're trained to basically blow a dog whistle, and the people who are really amazing at that work get a shot at it, no matter where they are. Geography doesn't matter anymore. And so in that world where anybody can call on you, you are now competing against tens of thousands of firms instead of 10 firms. And so how are you going to be unique in that marketplace? That's where positioning takes over to give you that edge. And so the world has changed drastically that way.
Interesting. So it has changed, I'm sure, but has your advice changed? Like when you first got started, what would be the mindset of somebody coming in asking to work with you? Well, first of all, would they ask to work with you, or did you have to do a lot of outbound business development? Was it that ad and reputation alone that got you there?
Well, in the early days, it was definitely that one ad that fella Cam Foote at Creative Business put up there for me for free. And that was a newsletter that he sent out monthly to everybody. And that was my sole source of business for, I don't know, maybe a year and a half or so, till I woke up and realized that I had my own client concentration problem. So to get out of that problem, I decided to essentially, it was buy credibility by putting my own paid ad using a full page in every issue of Communication Arts. And so some people would see me there, and the ones who didn't, I would make sure that they knew I had a full page ad in Communication Arts so that I could essentially buy credibility. So I would ask like, oh, so how did you hear about me? Did you see my, before I gave them a chance to answer the question, I would say, oh, did you see my full page ad in Communication Arts?
Okay.
And that happened. Now that was very expensive. It was almost, I think, $4,000 a month, and I've been working by myself at that time, and I still am. I very intentionally not hired employees. I've been a one-man band these 23 years, but it was a lot of money, almost $4,000 a month, as I recall. And this was in the mid 90s. And I said to myself at the time, there must be a cheaper way to draw these prospects to me. There weren't any ESPs. There were no email service providers at the time. Certainly couldn't buy a list. Only a couple ISPs were even in town. And so I got a T1 line. Most of your listeners probably don't even know what a T1 line is, but it was a 1.5 megabit per second line. And at the time, those lines were serving entire big office towers.
Yeah.
And now your iPhone is like probably 3 times that speed. It was about $1,100 a month. I had it to my living room, and I had a web server on a Mac. I had an email server and a DNS server on the Mac. And what I would do is and I put the web page up, which was very early in those days, and people would find me through search engines, and I would collect their email addresses. And I started in 1997, started sending out really what I hoped was insightful. It wasn't called a blog. There weren't blogs at the time, but just insightful emails in exchange for their email addresses. And then every once in a while at the bottom, I'd announce a seminar I was doing or talk about some sort of consulting service I was doing. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was doing content marketing. And so now there are 26,000 opt-in subscribers to my weekly emails. And that's been the primary source of work. Now, I write books, I speak at conferences and so on, but most of the interest out there comes from just people subscribing for years and years. And then at some point, some need comes up and we talk.
Yeah. I mean, that's how you build a brand, right? Like, I think people are really focused on saying, brand building is something people think is tactical around platforms that are here today. But it sounds like, I mean, it's never really been a here today thing. It's always build the brand and the platform where people are. And so back then it was, use your skills. Obviously it sounds like you had a lot of skills that you had developed by providing services at the agency. You were able to cobble together a system that when there wasn't a system out there. And then over time, you're like, okay, well, I don't need to have a T1 line anymore for $1,100. I don't need to write code on the weekends. All I need to do is just move over to MailChimp or whatever you use for a platform. And basically, eventually the technology caught up with the ambition.
Right, exactly. And the only common theme over all those years was disseminating critical insight with a point of view. That's the only thread that runs through all these years, is developing insight and then disseminating it with a point of view. And to do that, you have to be charging enough so that you have the time to spend to develop that insight and to hone it and to think about it and write about it and edit it and rethink about it. And if you're not charging enough, if your business isn't successful enough, then you've always got your nose down trying to make money as opposed to thinking about what it is that is your unique point of view that you can write about all the time. To me, that's the most important thing. In fact, I was thinking about what do I want to say in sort of my sort of annual themed email at the beginning of this next year. And what I want to tell principals is write more. You need to write more because you're not spending enough time developing your own unique insight. You're spending most of your time doing work on behalf of your clients rather than on behalf of your brand.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like, I always say that you eat your own dog food, and that's probably not the best metaphor out there, but basically you're saying if you tell an agency that they need to create a high margin business so they can go and focus on developing this content so they can have this never ending stream of potential customers, prospects coming in so that they can always be out there and be the thought leaders that they need to be, you need to do that yourself. And it sounds like you built sort of the machine to be able to do that. And it's a multi-year investment. So that's actually something that I'm curious about, it being a multi-year investment. I think that a lot of people think of their business as like, how do I get the most out of this year? Or how do I make my goals for this year? And they don't realize that the decisions they make or the lack of decision they make in this year may hurt them 5 years from now. Is that something that you noticed as well? Was this a slow build, or did it sort of just jump in there and happen just once you decided to commit to it?
It was a very slow build, and it's a very insightful question. I imagine that's sort of how you think as well, even though you and I haven't talked about this. But you mentioned in your introduction that you've done dozens and dozens and dozens of these podcasts. Well, there's no immediate return on your investment for yourself. You just decided a while ago that you're going to peel back from doing work for clients all the time. You're going to do something that will draw a lot of your prospects to you and want them to continue receiving your emails because of these podcasts that you develop. That's the long view, right? And I just think that most people in your shoes don't do that. And I admire the fact that you not only thought about doing something that doesn't have immediate return on investment, but it sets you up as an expert because you are. And also people, they're drawn to you because you're essentially helping them for many, many years before they may even write a check to you. It's setting you up as the expert, and it's exactly the same thing. And it's the big picture. Not, you mentioned earlier that we don't do this work for ourselves, which is so true. And people are always joking about how the cobbler's son doesn't have any shoes. And, I've heard that joke so many thousands of times, it's not even funny anymore. But then when they do, let's say they decided to send out an email or write a blog, it's crap content, and it's stuff that nobody really is interested in except maybe their clients. It's not insight. It's just patting themselves on the back instead of giving something to people that really, really helps them and setting them up as experts. It's really pathetic. It's sort of what got me into this field, and it's what keeps me there. Mm-hmm. When I look out there on the landscape of other agencies, I see more and more agencies doing exactly that. They're doing great insight development and so on, but still they're in such a small minority. I'm sure you've seen the same thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that people will dabble in it, but they don't really commit. And I can understand why, like you said, is that they're primarily trying to get the work done for people and they want to focus. But I think that it takes an extra effort in order to do this type of inbound, lead generation and marketing, but it pays off in the end. And it may not pay off, like this podcast particular episode may never pay off, but like you said, it's the back catalog. It's being able to look on years of working on something and having made an impact and introducing yourself to new people. And I think this format in particular like one thing that I like to do is experiment with mediums. Like, how can I communicate a message and how can I create the human element? And I find that writing, I've always been a big writer, and I love writing, but I think that the written word doesn't have nearly as much emotion as the voice, as you can do in a podcast. And so I've found that this medium, it's not for everybody. Not everybody listens to podcasts. But I mean, it's in the thousands of people that download each episode, so it's pretty solid. But it's more emotionally connecting to do a podcast than maybe to write a blog post. And so I think that it is important for people to experiment and say, well, how do I reach people and get them to trust what we're doing?
Yeah, exactly. And some people, like the idea of writing an email every week, like I do, would feel like death to them because they don't enjoy writing. But those same folks, some of them might hear the idea of a podcast like what you're doing and say they could really warm up to that idea. And I do think you're exactly right. You have to pick something that's not idealistic. You have to pick something that you actually are drawn to. It's like the difference between me playing racquetball 3 times a week or me running on a treadmill. I'd rather slit my wrist than run on a treadmill, but I enjoy racquetball, so I'm drawn to doing it, and the net effect is the same. So in our marketing efforts, we've got it, like if you love speaking, well, then you should do it. If you love writing, you should do it. The podcast, you should do it, whatever, but you should love something, even if nobody listens, right? The notion, like, you are getting smarter in these few minutes, and I'm getting smarter in these few minutes. It's putting ourselves on the line to think on our feet. And even if nobody's listening, it helps us be smarter to be engaged in this notion of marketing.
Yeah, I mean, and you say, and I like what you talk about with love. You have to love this for 2 reasons. One is, if you have to love it so that when you do it for 2 weeks and you blog for 2 months and nobody responds and you get 0 opens and nothing happens,
right?
Love is what's going to propel you to keep on doing it.
Yeah, right.
And then the other thing is you have to love it because that comes across in what you write. Now, I know a lot of people think that the written word is a commodity in some ways. They think that you can outsource it, or you can pay somebody like Fiverr.com. You can get 200 words for $5, right? Like, those are all, like, it's cheap to get words, but to get somebody to care and get somebody to take notice, you can tell the difference between good copy and bad copy immediately, and you can tell the difference between something that's genuine and something that's fake immediately. And so I think that's what people really need to focus on is the connection. And it doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be time consuming. It just has to be genuine.
Genuine, that's right. And then, of course, if you're an expert, then it also has to have some insight. If you aren't an expert, it doesn't have to be, like, you could be a blogger about a lifestyle. It doesn't have to be insightful. It just needs to be legitimate or insightful or authentic. But you and I and your listeners, the stuff has to be insightful. And I wrote an article recently. It's probably had the most interaction out there of anything I've ever written. And it was, I forget the exact title, but it was something about the difference between insight and content. And to me, insight is something you read, and you can't just, what you read or maybe a podcast you listen to won't let you just walk away without you being changed. You are forced by the quality of the insight to either say yes or no, to agree or disagree with the things that you've heard. Whereas content, you can absorb it partly and then just walk away and never think about it. Insight forces you to agree or disagree with it. And that's the difference between those two. And I feel like, why is it that so few agencies can really generate insight? I think it goes back to, it's partly because they don't have the time to do it because they're working so hard all the time and not capturing the money they could. But the other reason is because their positioning is so poor that all their clients are so different. And so they're not learning something new. They're spending all of their learning time trying to get up to speed on their client's business, as opposed to skipping that step and immediately jumping to pattern matching. I think that's the difference.
Yeah. And I also think that it's always, you can do it a few times, but it's hard to turn it into a routine, because by the nature of having clients, they get first priority. And so if you always give them first priority, you may never get back to writing that second post or doing the second thing. So I think that a lot of it is just prioritization and then culture. I think that
Right.
a lot of companies just don't set up a culture where they do that. Where I've seen companies where their culture requires, I don't know if it requires or strongly encourages people to blog. Like, for example, there's this analytics firm called Lunametrics, and at least 3 times a week they have a top-notch article, and they've been able to grow significantly because they're sharing knowledge about the projects they work on. So they're summarizing it. But the thing is, the same author really only writes once a month. It maybe once every 2 months. It just happens to be that they have a big enough team now that they can keep on, you publish one thing every 1 or 2 months, and your blog continues to have fresh content, and they've built it into their culture. And I've seen that company grow from about 4 people to the 50s, 50 plus people that they've grown to because they are the thought leader, right? They're the ones who put themselves out there. Now, there's other ways to grow from 4 to 50, but I've been following this company for a long time, and I just have so much respect for them by the way they've been able to do that.
Yeah, and there's also something, I don't know that company, but there's also something about that firm where the perspective is not that you're wasting your time writing a blog instead of doing client work this week. No, they've elevated the role of that content or insight development as just as important as so, because in many firms, if you're not constantly billing for client work, then, you're beat over the head. And so obviously their culture is such that clients or employees don't feel like they're getting dinged because they're not doing client work. They're actually they're furthering their own careers by participating in that as well.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a tough piece of it, is deciding to do that and committing to it.
Right.
So going back to you starting your business and working on, working with other agencies, how do you figure out like a business model to do that? How does it work to become the consultant, to be, one, a business model that allows you to stay independent, one person shop for 23 years? How does all that, what are your early days like? You're getting business coming in, you have a pretty good idea of what you want to do, but how does it work from there?
Well, so the timing was a little odd in the sense that there were like 2 big light bulbs that went off. One was the first light bulb was that, there's enough work out there that I could do this for a living and I really enjoy it. The second light bulb was actually having enough of that work. And so there was this 5 or 6 month interim period. This is just a very temporary period where I had committed to doing this consulting, but there wasn't quite enough work. And so during those, I think it was like 5 months, I had a second shift job, and it was a blue collar manufacturing job. It didn't bother me at all. I was so committed to this. But what that led me to do was to hold my pricing high. I knew that I didn't know I'd be successful, but I did know that I was not going to give away my work, and I was going to charge a pretty steep price for it. But if I was going to starve or hold that pricing integrity, I figured the pressure would be too great. So I took a second shift job just for those 5 months so that I wasn't tempted to give away my work. And then after that, now I wrote it. One of the books I've written is on management. It's been probably the best seller of all the books I've written. So I understand how to manage people, and I was at least average, maybe a little above average, I don't know, at managing people. But I decided that I really wanted to spend my time developing insight and delivering that insight, and I didn't want to spend my time managing a team. So I decided that, I would have to work very hard. If I was going to be any good, then there was always going to be this temptation to grow and add employees. And I joke about it that if I didn't work so hard at it, I would be much larger. And so what that forced me to do I could just say no to work, but instead I decided that whenever the workload got me to the place where I was tempted to hire somebody, I would just raise prices. And so a main program that I did then and still do now. Originally it was 4,000, and then it became 6, and then 8, and then 10, and then 12, and then 16, and now it's 18,000. Of course it's better, it's deeper now, but essentially the time that it took to deliver that has been the same. So I did not want to let growth happen to me, and because I've seen so many agency owners allow that to happen to them, where the marketplace determines how big they're going to be. And I was never going to make that one mistake. I determined. So I'm going to decide how big I want to be based on what I personally want to do and what I enjoy and what I'm good at. And then I'm not going to and if the marketplace said to me, David, you need to be bigger, you need to hire people, I was going to ignore that message because it didn't matter to me. I knew what I wanted, and that's what I was going to be. I wasn't going to let the marketplace decide that for me. So now, it's crazy successful in the sense that, I take anywhere from 10 to 12 weeks off a year, bill roughly $1 million in fees every year. And that's because I've been relentless about those choices. I haven't made all the right decisions along the way for sure, but that's one of the decisions that I feel like I have made correctly over these years.
Wow, that's incredible. So you're using, well, one, the foresight to know that when you're early in the process and you haven't proven out the model yet, to hold your ground is really it takes a lot of fortitude to do that for sure. Yeah. But you're also living what you teach these agencies to do, because that's the advice. If you were to take off your own business and you were to say this to an agency owner, it'd be the same advice. Don't, it's exactly what you're saying. Don't grow just because the market tells you to. Don't do these things because there's temptations. Know what type of business you want to run, and then do that instead. Don't go chasing shiny objects every single time they come around. Hold firm and build a business that you're proud of, that you want to be in the future. And I think that's anybody who's listening to this. We have people who work at agencies. We have people who are thinking about starting their own agency, people who are thinking about being consultants, all kinds of different paths that people may take. But the number one thing here is to understand that growth is good, but it's not the only thing. And also, growing a brand and creating whatever you do, making it so valuable that you can charge enough that you can spend the extra time doing research and development and growing your skills and continuing to excel. That margin perpetuates itself. If you can charge more because you did all the research and you had all the extra time because you charged more, then you can charge more the next time. Like you said, you can keep on raising your prices and raising your profile and lifestyle, all by basically continuing to have a high margin that you reinvest into your business.
Yeah, and for me, the benefits to me personally are clear, but the benefits to my clients are very clear in my mind too, because making decent money and having the extra time means that I can constantly be doing fresh research on behalf of my clients and always be reinventing myself. That's they don't care if I make money necessarily or if I take time off. They care about how this impacts them. And the way it impacts them is that if I'm charging enough money, it frees me up to do lots of fresh thinking and learning and getting exposed to all sorts of things so that they can be reading my emails. I'm sure they read lots of other people's emails as well, but it sort of feeds this information flow for them. So running your business well isn't just for you, it's for your clients as well. And we talked earlier about doing your own marketing. If you're constantly telling your clients about how they ought to be doing marketing differently, if you're not doing it for yourself, it's just sort of a lame claim that just doesn't really resonate with your clients.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's telling people what they need to do, and then they look at your website and it's junk, right? It doesn't do anything there.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the other thing is, this is another thing that I teach everybody that will listen, is that you want to stay close to the source of revenue. And so if you can increase your fees up to $18,000 for a project, and the agency now makes 10 times that or 100 times that over the course of their lifetime, then that should be the easiest investment that they make, because you've done enough, you've worked with enough people that you know that, hey, working with me makes it so that you can increase your cash flow. It means that you can increase your billings or whatever they're looking to do, increase your profitability. That's what I deliver for you. And on average, every client that comes in, they pay this much and this is what they get back. And so you can eventually, the results sell themselves.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think staying close to the revenue, I've never heard that phrase put quite like that, but I think that makes a lot of sense. Tying the decisions you make for yourself to that, tying the kind of work you do for your clients to that, that's a very good way to put that under that one umbrella.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're nearing the end of our time. There's one thing that I wrote down that you said earlier that I thought was really interesting, and I was wondering if you could elaborate. And you mentioned that you had a client concentration problem. And maybe you said that agencies had that too. What is a client concentration problem?
That I used to just call it a guerrilla client problem, in that I had one source of revenue that was far too large, in the sense that if anything happened to that source of revenue, then I was really screwed. The external marketplace, the more professional marketplace, would call that a client concentration problem, in the sense that they had too many eggs in one basket. And so for agencies, so in my case, it was because all of my work was coming through one referral source. In the case of agencies, you would determine that you have a client concentration problem by noting that your single largest source of revenue, which would be all the departments under the same corporate ownership umbrella, amounts to more than 25% of your billings. At that point, the yellow or red light should come on, because if they leave you, then they're going to put the agency at risk. So there's an optimum size. You could have a client that's too large, and most people understand that, but you could also have clients that are way too small, and sort of like death by a thousand lashes. And that's what most agencies struggle with. So I had all of my work coming from one place. That's what I meant by that.
Oh yeah, and I think that's definitely a warning we should all heed. It's all right probably to start a company or to start a business with one source, but soon you need to start creating them yourself, or you need to diversify your revenue sources. Otherwise, like you said, if one of them leaves, that could be the end of your business. It could be you won't be able to make payroll, you won't be able to do anything if that happens. And so as quickly as you can get that business or a drink from the fire hose of somebody giving you leads, I mean, you shouldn't say no, but as quickly as you can do that, you should also be planning where the next are going to come from.
Right, exactly.
Great. So, like I said, we are nearing the end of our time. I like to close with just any advice that you'd give to somebody starting off in this world now, like in probably the marketing world, or if they were looking to start their own agency, or they want to take on a bigger role within their agency. Any advice that you might give to them?
I think the most important piece of advice is still the same one, and that's around positioning. Like, what is it that you understand uniquely that other folks don't? I think if you understand that, you can parlay that into so many little micro successes, and understanding that very clearly, articulating it, and hanging on to it, and then constantly learning around that. Not just understanding marketing, not just understanding an industry, but what unique approach or knowledge do you have that very few other people have, and then keep building on that. I think that's probably, the rest of it comes pretty easily. Once you've got the positioning in place, you know where to reach your prospects, you know what to say to them, you know how to design the service offerings, you know how to hire if you have employees at your firm. Everything is answered back to, with a line drawn back to that positioning question, whether we're individuals working for somebody else, or running a firm of just one person, or running a firm of 100 people. That question, I think we cannot escape.
Absolutely. I think that's a great piece of advice to leave us on. Thanks so much, David, for joining us on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed chatting with you.
That was an awesome conversation. David is laser focused on helping agencies succeed by showing them the many points where they can fail to gain traction. It's deeply rooted in his own experiences, and it's based on timeless business principles. It was remarkable to me to hear how he got started in this business, a true story of finding his calling while it was calling back at him. This is how most businesses start. It's rarely a linear plan of attack. You put something out there, you see where you get traction, and then you make your adjustments accordingly. If you focus on it long enough, over time you're going to have a great business, or you might give up trying. But you want to listen to your business, you want to listen to your advisors, and you want to grow both personally and professionally in your business. So thanks for the chat, David. For show notes, visit Jeffalytics.com/recourses.